But no one thought to ask how the computers originally counted the results. As dusk fell on election night, one official noticed something very strange, a sign that the heart of America's democracy was in danger. In Volusia County, Florida, an election computer counted Al Gore's totals backwards. He had negative votes.
It was showing a minus sign in front of the votes that it had subtracted from Gore. I mean, it wasn't like it was trying to hide it. It says there's minus 16,022 votes here.
How could a computer that is supposed to protect the votes of you and me count backwards to give a candidate negative votes? Either it was an error, or someone had tried to rig the election. There was an investigation into the negative votes, and it was established that the problem couldn't have been due to machine failure, because only the totals for the presidential race were affected. It looked like a second memory card may have been loaded onto the computer. Memory cards contain the votes, but this second card had disappeared, so they couldn't check it. The origin of the negative votes was never proved, but some engineers thought that it might have been an attempt to tamper with the election. But no one will ever know for sure. The software that counted those votes was owned by Global Election Systems. In 2002, they were bought by the Diebold Corporation. The software is a trade secret. It's against federal and state law to look inside Diebold's voting machines.
I was the chief technical advisor to the Secretary of State of the largest state in the United States, and I was not allowed to look at the software running in Diebold or any other vendor's voting systems. To this day, I have not been allowed to look at that software.
Software like this is installed in more than 30 states. If someone tampers with it, or it just malfunctions, then the wrong people can win elections. If that happens, hundreds of representatives, judges, and other officials may hold offices they are not elected to. Democrat or Republican, it affects us all. Beth Harris lives in Seattle with her family. A writer, publicist, and grandmother, she knew nothing about computer programming or election systems. But when her county bought a new touchscreen system, she started to ask questions. The answers she got reveal a system in crisis.
You know, I had a life before I did this, and I never really envisioned becoming any kind of an activist or advocate. But sometimes something comes into your life and you know, well, if I don't do it, then maybe no one else will, and then maybe I don't want to bequeath that to my children. I put 3 words into a news search engine, voting machines and glitch, and found dozens and dozens of elections that were miscounted by the machines. And about that time, I thought, we really have a problem.
What Bev had found was that you couldn't necessarily rely on the election results produced by voting machines. In Louisiana, Susan Berniker, a Republican candidate, filmed the proof when she went to check her results on a touchscreen computerized voting system.
This is where I came the day that the warehouses are open to the candidates to inspect. So I came here with an old college buddy. He grabbed his camera, and I asked him to show me how the machine worked. So I just started fooling around with the machine. And it's when I pressed the button next to my name, and then I look down and I see Mr. Gambaluca's name in the display when I press Susan Bernacker.
Shall we do it again?
Do it again.
Yeah. Okay, here we go again. I'm pressing Bernacker. Gambaluca shows up.
So we went down the row. We probably tested 15 machines, and I said, you know what, we don't have to test anymore. And that is when I said, oh my goodness, this is terrible. We can't count our votes. So how do we know this is right?
Because the casting of the vote is secret, it's rare to get documentary evidence of machines miscounting. But Susan's experience isn't an isolated problem. Computers count around 80% of America's votes. It's the counties that run elections and buy voting machines. So the make and model varies from place to place, but there are two major types. On a touchscreen machine, the software counts the selections you make on the screen. Optical scan machines read a paper ballot that you have voted on.
7 o'clock, polls are closed.
The votes themselves are stored on the computer's memory cards.
This is the voter cartridge. This cartridge is very important, and it goes right into our bag.
There it is.
These memory cards are taken to a master computer, sometimes called the central tabulator, which reads the votes, adds them up, and then declares the winner. The problem is that you can't see a computer adding up the votes. So, how do you know if it's counted correctly?
Suppose that we didn't have any computers at all, and when you went to vote, the voting booth was separated by a curtain, and there was a guy behind the curtain who would write down your votes. So you just dictate them, he writes them down, and when you're done, you leave without being able to look at the ballot. Most people in their right mind would not trust this process. The guy behind the curtain could be incompetent, he could hear your votes wrong and record them improperly, or it could be that he doesn't like your political affiliation and would prefer to see your votes cast for someone else. In an electronic voting machine, you don't have a little guy inside the machine taking dictation, but you have lots of people who are involved in writing the software and lots of people who could have touched the software before it went into that machine. If one of those people puts something malicious in the software and it's distributed to all the machines, then that one person could be responsible for the change of possibly tens of thousands of votes, maybe even hundreds of thousands across the country. That's a very dangerous situation.
You know, I began looking into these voting machines, and one reason I was so curious is because it's a secret how they work. The companies that make them keep it a secret. None of the computer scientists felt they could even look at the code because the code was supposed to be a secret. The certification labs that examine it keep their process a secret of what they do, and even the election officials who buy the equipment are prohibited by their contract from ever looking and seeing how it works. What happened next really changed my life. I was looking for technicians who could perhaps answer some questions of mine, and while I was looking for technicians, I stumbled upon an obscure web page. The web page was an old predecessor of the Diebold election systems page, and I clicked the link, and that link took me to a site that was not a web page, but it was more like a library or an online filing system, and it contained a bunch of different files, just like you see on your computer. And within those were more files, and within those were more files. And the files were amazing. They were things like the software specifications, the software itself, the drawings for the hardware, the user manuals, passwords in some cases. It was the crown jewels for Diebold election systems.
Bev didn't know it, but what she just found was a computer program called GEMS. GEMS, made by the Diebold Corporation, counts around 40% of America's votes.
So I began downloading these files, and throughout the night, I continued to download them. Throughout the weekend, I continued to download them. There were so many files, it took about 40 hours to download all the files there were. And then I knew I would be working on this project for a long, long time.
Up to this point, only the voting machine companies knew how America's elections were actually counted. When Bev downloaded the Diebold software, the wall of secrecy began to crumble.
I want to thank you for joining us today. This is a program on electronic voting being put on by the Criminal Justice Section. We have here 4 panelists, one of whom is joining us from London as we speak. Russ Michaels, whose film you just saw, and I'm going to hold up and display for you the DVD case. It's called Hacking Democracy. And it's a documentary that was produced by HBO. Russell Michaels, who I know personally, is an Emmy-nominated filmmaker and journalist. In 2007, he was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Investigative Journalism for co-producing and directing the feature-length HBO documentary, Hacking Democracy. The film exposed how America's electronic voting machines can be hacked to steal elections. For the climax of the film, Russell organized a groundbreaking on-camera hack of Florida's actual default voting system. We're going to see that. The Hursty hack became famous as the first ever proven hack of an in-use system counting America's votes. We have 3 other panelists, each one more spectacular than the other. And I'm going to first introduce our scientist, Dr. Barbara Simons. Will you raise your hand or stand up or do something? I've known Barbara longer than I've known Russell. Barbara holds a PhD in computer science and is a former research scientist with IBM. She has been active in the voting integrity area since the early 2000s. She has been on the board of advisors of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission since 2008, and she co-authored Broken Ballots, Will Your Vote Count?, a book on voting technology. Of course, I have that here too. And it's actually readable. Simons is a former president of the Association for Computing Machinery, the oldest and largest international educational and scientific society for computing professionals. She is also board chair of an entity known as Verified Voting. And we have with us next to her right, the president of Verified Voting, Marion Schneider. She is a lawyer, and Verified Voting is a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization that advocates for legislation and regulation that promotes accuracy, transparency, and verifiability of elections. She formerly served as the Deputy Secretary for Elections and Administration for the Secretary of State of the state of Pennsylvania, and also served as Special Advisor to Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf on election issues. I met her last night. And next to Barbara on the other side is the Honorable Virginia M. Hernandez Covington. She is a United States District Court judge sitting in the Middle District of Florida, Tampa Division. I've known her since 1983. We were assistant U.S. attorneys together. Judge Covington began her career in Washington, D.C. as a trial attorney for the Federal Trade Commission, and then became an assistant state attorney in Tampa for Hillsborough County. In 1983, she joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Florida. Then in 2001, she was appointed to Florida's 2nd District Court of Appeals by Governor Jeb Bush, and in 2004, she was appointed to the federal bench by President George W. Bush. Now, the way we're going to proceed today is I'm going to ask Russ if he could please tell us something about what we just saw and how it came about that you became involved in this, what you discovered. We're then going to move to Barbara, who is a scientist, and she can talk to us about the technology of electronic voting and why there are issues regarding it and what the remedies might be. And Marion will tell us about what is going on in the legal arena. And finally, Judge Covington will discuss with us some of the court issues that have arisen in this field. So, Russ, can you please tell us, what are we watching?
Sure, and can I start by saying if anyone has any questions later on based on the 2 clips from my film we're showing, then I'd be very happy to answer any questions. So it's worth saying that at that time when I was first meeting Beth Harris and really trying to get my head around, because I'm not a computer scientist of any kind, I was trying to understand as an ordinary voter and citizen what the risks are and whether what she was saying was true and correct. But it's worth noting that at that time, the Diebold Election Systems Company was counting about a third of America's votes, I believe. It was 33 states that their election systems were in. So what Bev Harris had found by finding that source code, lots of documents, executable files, all kinds of things that were trade secret and were only hidden within their company until that moment she started downloading them all. I was trying to find out what she was saying and was it true. Diebold's internal memos were also leaked, and they backed up a lot of what we worried about was in the code and how the machines actually had been programmed. So I had lots of questions, and I flew out to LA to meet her, although she lives in Seattle. So one of the questions I had was, why had America, and I think it's still a valid question, why has America handed its vote count to secret software programming private companies? You don't know what they're doing, but they have to be trusted entities to do this job. The second question I had before a lot of people did was, who owns and controls those companies? And lastly, what can we do to prove what these machines are really doing? Because it's very hard with a black box to show on camera, for a start, what's going on inside it. Bev Harris set up blackboxvoting.org, which I think was the first ever elections watchdog for the public, and she handed the software and the code files to eminent scientists in America, such as Avi Rubin of Johns Hopkins University, and they started to examine it in a really forensic way, and suddenly we found that there were more terrible flaws than anybody had guessed. And I would ask Barbara to maybe elaborate on what did the scientists find when Bev Harris said, hey, you look at this?
It's my turn. Okay.
Hear me?
Yep. Hi, Russ.
Hi, hello everybody.
Hi. So, actually, I'm not sure if black box voting was started before verified voting or after, but we've been around for a long time. But anyway, I'm going to just give you a little background on how we got to where we are, and then, depending on time, some more information. So, basically, we can thank Florida for a lot of things, and in particular for the fact that we use computers extensively in our voting systems. Florida 2000, you remember looking at the hanging chads and all that. Well, one of the takeaways that some people assumed from that was that paper is bad and that computers would be good. And of course, it's not that paper is bad. There's nothing wrong with paper. What was bad was the way that paper was used with those punch card systems. For example, there are some areas of Florida where they didn't empty the chad trays. So when people tried to push down, it didn't go through all the way. Whereas I live in Palo Alto at the time, and we voted on the same machines and we didn't have hanging chads. So it wasn't the paper, it was the technology and how it was maintained. Although it wasn't a very good technology, but it's not because of paper. Basically what happened, and I think it was actually as a result of the 2002 midterms, which were also a mess in Florida, is the Help America Vote Act was passed. And the Help America Vote Act allocated a large sum of money, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion, to modernize our systems and accompanying activities. And so there was a bit of a gold rush because all of a sudden this federal money was available to the states. And a lot of these machines came to market pretty quickly with very strong vendor promises of security and something that was very appealing to a lot of election officials. Just push a button at the end of the election, you get the results. And having worked as a poll worker, I can tell you it's a very exhausting day. So that ability to just push the button and get the results was very appealing. They talked about federal certification, although that's a bit iffy. And as I say, gold rush mentality. So computers were introduced into voting, mainly because of all this money from the Help America Vote Act. Initially, a lot of these systems were paperless of the sort that Russ was talking about. There's something called direct recording electronic, typically touch screen. That's what the Diebold machines were that you saw in the clip. Now, this thing about the jumping votes, this woman was saying she pushed her name and another candidate came up. That could well be a calibration issue. These machines went out of calibration, or go out, because a lot of them are still in use, go out of calibration pretty easily. It's not a good technology to use for this. So my personal view is, if I'm going to rig an election, I'm not going to do it in such an obvious way. There are much more subtle ways of rigging elections where it's not obvious that there's a problem. And it's basically lousy engineering. So we, at Verified Voting and other election, people who are concerned about election integrity, started calling for something we called paper trails, because we wanted to be able to check on these paperless, well, these computers, basically, because the computer scientists knew you can't trust computers. I mean, that's something that we all know. So what happened was a lot of these machines were retrofitted with something called the Voter Verified Paper Audit Trail, which was, again, bad technology. It tends to be continuous roll thermal printed paper like what you get at a gas station, which, as you know, fades if you leave it in the sun. It's often hard to read. The font can be small. And one of the things that we learned was that people tend not to check. So the idea was that these machines were, that these paper rolls sort of recorded what the voters were doing, but voters didn't know that they should be checking, because they didn't know that this was supposed to check on the computer. So tests have shown that they didn't check them very much, so they really weren't a very good check. There's also paper ballot systems, which is what we have, for example, in California, and actually in most of the states, the majority of the states. And typically, as you saw there, you can either fill in an oval or connect a broken arrow, and then on the piece of paper, so that's marked by the voter, typically. There are problems with scanners, and then they're put into scanners, and the scanners are operated by computers. So these, again, we have computers everywhere in our elections in the United States, almost everywhere. So the scanners are computers, and if they're too sensitive, they might pick up stray marks and claim that there's a double vote and disqualify the vote. If they're not sensitive enough, they might miss a mark. But the good thing is that you've got paper ballots. So it's good for two reasons. One is you can check on the computers, and then the second is if the scanners are down, people can still vote on the paper ballots, and they can be scanned later. So it's a way of avoiding the long lines that we've seen in 2012 and 2016. So the long lines, many of them occurred because people had to vote on the computers, on the DREs, on the touchscreen machines. There are problems with software, and this is true of any software. If it were easy to write bug-free software, we wouldn't have companies like Apple and Microsoft sending out fixes frequently. And many of these are security fixes. So it's not an easy thing to do, and there's no reason to think that computer software has no bugs when everything else does, right? So, and of course, these fixes often are to patch security holes. And because it's difficult to find bugs, because again, if they could be found easily, they would be found. It makes it possible to sort of think about hiding malware in software. If it were easy to find bugs, it would be easy to find malware, right? Does that make sense? I mean, the fact is that it's possible to, and we know of cases where that's happened, where there's been malware hidden in software which has been found, but it can be very obscure. And I'm not saying voting machines, I'm just saying software, computers. So anyway, moving on. So of course, computerized voting systems can themselves have software bugs. There could be malware. And I should just mention, one of the things that we heard a lot in 2016 was that you don't have to worry about voting machines being hacked because they're not connected to the internet. And typically they aren't connected to the internet. But these machines have to be programmed, because for each election you've got candidates you've got to tell them about, you've got to tell them about their location on the ballot. So you have to program the voting machines, and that programming is done with other computers. And those computers frequently at some point are connected to the internet. If they are infected, they in turn can infect the voting machines. So the fact that the voting machines aren't connected to the internet does not protect us from hacking. Also, another shibboleth that was that we heard a lot about was, well, you don't have to worry because there's so many different kinds of voting systems in the United States, nobody can hack the presidential election. And the fact is, you know, because we have an electoral college, there are swing states, swing districts, and swing states, you don't have to hack the whole country to change the election. You can focus on a small number of districts in a small number of states and change the outcome. Testing and certification has been weak. When these machines first came out, it's still voluntary standards, voluntary testing, although many states require the testing. But a lot of the testing, especially in the early days, did not focus on issues like security and accessibility, or they didn't focus adequately. And if you think about it, again, going back to software, simply being able to test the software and say it passed the tests doesn't prove it's secure, because if you could do it with the voting software, you could do it with all software. So you may be able to satisfy certain tests, but there still could be a problem that hasn't been uncovered yet. I mean, that's the problem with software. It's very complicated. So there was also state testing that was done, independent of the federal. Again, this is kind of old, 2006 and 2007, but the state of California did something called a top-to-bottom review, where the major systems that were used in California were tested by computer security experts, and they were able to get permission basically because the Secretary of State demanded it of the voting systems. This was actually quite an accomplishment to get the voting vendors to allow independent computer security experts to test their systems. And basically they found they were all lacking, they were all insecure. It was very disturbing. They also were being marketed as being good vehicles for voters with disabilities, especially voters with vision problems. And one of the types of testing that was done in California was for accessibility, and again, the machines were found to be sadly wanting. They really were not very good at all. Ohio did a follow-up in 2007 where they verified all of the problems uncovered in California and found some additional ones. And there were additional, I'm not going to go over all the testing history, but it was very disturbing to uncover these problems in machines that were being used for elections. So here's an example. Again, Diebold was mentioned in the video. One of the things that Bev uncovered was in 2002, there were last-minute patches made to Georgia just before the election. This was, I think, the first time these machines were used in a national election in Georgia, 2002. There was no independent oversight of the software. And again, these machines are paperless, the ones used in Georgia. And then Bev found the OpenFTP website in 2003. In 2006, a Princeton team showed how to hack into these machines, and there are videos online, including testimony before House, I don't know, maybe it's a congressional committee demonstrating how to hack into these machines. Nonetheless, these machines are still in use today in the entire state of Georgia. And these machines we've known how to hack since early 2000s. So here's an example of the kind of glitch you can find. They are called glitches because we don't know what is really happening. We don't know if it's unintentional or not. But anyway, this is almost certainly unintentional. In Carteret County, South Carolina, in 2004, people were doing early voting on a paperless machine, and somebody forgot to check about the capacity of the machine. So at some point, it stopped recording people's votes. And over 2,000 votes were not recorded. People went and voted on the machines, but the machine just ignored it. So there were so this became known because they knew how many people had checked in to vote, and they knew how many votes the machine contained. And there was no way to know what happened to those votes that went into a black hole. So there were various legal attempts made to try to deal with this, and that, for a bunch of lawyers, you might find kind of interesting, the various attempts that they made. But finally, everything was thrown out by the courts. So finally, people who voted for one of the candidates submitted affidavits saying they'd voted for this candidate, and the judge ruled, based on the number of affidavits that he had received, that that candidate was the winner. So as far as I know, this is the first election in the United States that was decided by affidavits. The machines that did this was called the Unilink Patriot. It was used in the state of Virginia until it was decertified in 2017, shortly before this big election for House, where there was surprising results. Up till that point, they were still used in some parts of Virginia. They were still using this machines and some other forms of paperless DREs. You can have glitches with paper ballots too, because again, these are computers, right? So Potawatomi County, Iowa, in a 2006 Republican primary, people looked at the results and said these have to be wrong because the candidate that was declared the winner was this kid who everybody knew wasn't going to win, and the person who they knew was going to win didn't win. And so because they had paper ballots, they actually had to go to court to be able to count these paper ballots, but they went to court, they did a manual count, and what they discovered was these machines had been incorrectly programmed because they had ballot rotation, and it didn't take into account the ballot rotation. So candidate A got the votes for candidate B got the votes for candidate C, and so on. So it wasn't that the machine itself was faulty, it was that the programming was faulty. So that's something you have to worry about. Because they had paper ballots, they could correct it. If it had been a paperless machine, they would have been stuck with the results because there would have been nothing they could do. So many old systems are falling apart, systems such as the ones in Georgia, but in other places, were developed in the early 2000s. They are using software from the early 2000s, some of which is no longer being maintained by the original vendors like Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't make voting machines software, but they make software that voting machines use. And if you think about it, do you know anyone who has a computer from those days? And yet we're voting on machines that are basically computers that are really archaic and not being maintained. The hardware is also failing. Some election officials are being forced to cannibalize some of their machines to keep others running. The election officials want new machines. The ones with these old machines want new machines, but the problem is money. And so this is an issue where, I don't know if Marion's going to have a chance to talk about it or not, but this is something we have been focusing on, trying to get money so that election officials who know they need to replace these machines are able to do so. And again, these DREs contributed to long lines. One of the problems we have in talking about this issue is explaining to policymakers and reporters that there could be a problem, and maybe you know, a bunch of attorneys, maybe you can help us, because they say, well, show us that an election was rigged. And quite frankly, I can't show you that any election was rigged. Right, because if it's paperless, there's nothing to check. You just can't. And even if it's paper, a lot of times people don't look at the paper. So for example, in the 2016 presidential, there was an effort to do a recount in Michigan. It was stopped by the courts. They have all paper there. We could have done a total recount and found if there was any problem or not, but the court stopped it. So it doesn't do any good to have paper if you don't look at the paper afterwards. So we have to have paper, and we have to look at the paper. So should I go into internet voting or not? I don't know, where do you want me to?
I would like for you to talk about internet voting. I think it's very important, perhaps the MOVE Act. And also, why can't you just check the code that these companies are developing and using? It seems like that would be an easy way to verify whether something works or doesn't.
Well, of course, we can't check the code that these companies are using because we can't look at the code, and B, even if you check it, you can't be sure you caught everything, as I said earlier. But here's an old slide. I haven't updated it. But is there anything that you see in common with all these places? They've all been hacked. And I could have added a lot more. So again, the obvious. How can underfunded, understaffed, under-resourced local election officials protect their systems when they don't have a lot of computer security expertise, if they have any at all? Because how many local election officials have access to a really hotshot computer security expert? Hardly any. They are underfunded. I mean, and that's a major problem we have in the United States. And they have to be able to protect themselves against foreign adversaries, adversaries who are well-financed, foreign countries, political operatives, and rogue hackers. So the idea that you can have internet voting where people can protect themselves from attack, I think, is just naive. What we call internet voting is you return a voted ballot over the internet. And that can be via web or as an email attachment. So I've actually had, I don't know if this doesn't happen recently, but a few years ago, an election official said, we don't use internet voting, we have email voting. We send results back by email. Of course, email goes over the internet. And email voting is, in fact, very insecure. And voting, if you are voting from a personal computer, a smartphone, a smart tablet, or something, if your vote goes over the internet, which it does from these devices, it's internet voting. There are no regulations for internet voting. No independent standards, independent testing, government oversight, legal accountability, or ability to recount. NIST was asked to develop standards, but they basically didn't because of problems with the technology. And there are two quotes here. Technology that is widely deployed today is not able to mitigate many of the threats to casting ballots via the web, and malware on voters' personal computers pose a serious threat that could compromise the security or integrity of voted ballots. In the United States, about 30 states, I didn't check to get the precise number, allow internet voting for military overseas voters. The MOVE Act, which Andy wanted me to talk about, was developed some years ago. I don't remember the exact date. And basically what the MOVE Act does is it requires states to provide blank copies of the ballots at least 45 days in advance of the election. So voters like military overseas can download blank copies, fill them out, put them in the mail, and mail them back by old-fashioned mail. And the MOVE Act also provides for expedited return of voted ballots. So one of the arguments for internet voting is that military overseas can't get their ballots back in time. By providing the blank ballots online, you've cut that return time in half, and then by expedited return, you've cut it even more. So basically, my view is that internet voting is a solution in search of a problem. You probably have heard people touting blockchain as being the solution. Blockchains are being proposed for all kinds of things. They do not solve this problem, and if anyone's curious, I can go into more detail later as to why blockchains really don't touch the major security problems of internet voting. So, is anyone here from Canada? Oh, yeah, okay, well, Canada. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a special committee, federal committee, which looked into internet voting. I actually had the privilege of testifying before them, and their recommendation is that internet voting not be implemented at this time, so you will not have internet voting at the federal level in Canada. But, okay, so BC also looked at this a few years earlier because they were thinking of having internet voting. And they found that, contrary to the myth, internet voting does not increase voter participation, and it does not increase participation by young people. What the BC study discovered was basically the people who vote over the internet would have voted anyway, internet or not. I mean, there might be a teensy increase of voter participation, but hardly any, and it doesn't bring out more young people to vote. They did a cost analysis, which shows that internet voting is not cost saving. I don't want to go on too long, but I can send you this information if especially people from Canada want it. I'll skip that. Their recommendation was do not implement internet voting for either local or provincial elections at this time. Toronto. In Toronto, the city council wanted to do internet voting, although the local election officials in Toronto, who I must say are really good, recommended against it. The city council went ahead anyway. They signed a contract with a vendor called Seidel. And they also, but before they signed the contract, they had a really good RFP. And that RFP mandated that any vendor who submitted their documents had to allow the city to test them. And they tested for security, and they tested for accessibility, and they brought in they got really good experts to do the testing. The security tests found that all three vendors who submitted proposals, that their systems were insecure. They also found that they weren't very good for accessibility. Nonetheless, the city council wanted to do internet voting, they ignored the recommendations, and they signed a contract with Seidel. Fortunately for Toronto, they were able to get out of the contract when Seidel didn't meet the benchmarks that were included in this very strong RFP. I mean, the Toronto people did a really good job. Still, Ontario, there's widespread internet voting in Ontario municipalities. I actually talked to one of the local election officials in a small town in Ontario, and he said, why would anyone want to hack our elections? I mean, now, I live part-time on Bowen Island, which is just across from Vancouver, and we've had some very contentious elections there, even though only 4,000 people live on Bowen Island. So, that idea that nobody wants to rig our election, I mean, I just think is naive. Anyway, Ontario has widespread internet voting for municipalities, although, of course, the largest municipality, which is Toronto, is not doing it, but these small ones are. So, I think I'm going to stop there. Yeah, well, that's just an example of hacking that's been done to the Canadian government. I mean, really, I'll be happy to talk to Canadians afterwards because the situation in Ontario is not good, and there's pressure to have internet voting continuously in Canada, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barbara. I have a few questions for her, but I'm going to wait until we finish with our other panelists. Marion?
Sure. Do you have my slide deck? My slide deck? Oh, there it is. Sorry.
And I failed to say this at the beginning. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and endeavor to answer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this presentation today, and thank you, Andy, for inviting me here to lovely Vancouver. I wanted to say a little bit more. I am a litigator. I've been a lawyer for a long time, and one of the cases that I litigated was Banfield against Cortez, which was a suit that we filed in 2006 in an attempt to establish that direct recording electronic voting machines, which are the ones that we've been talking about and which were the ones on the video, violated the Pennsylvania Election Code and the Pennsylvania Constitution. For a variety of reasons, that case dragged on for 10 years, and at the end of the day, the petitioners lost. But at that time, I was the deputy secretary for elections, so I found myself for the first time in my legal career being on the winning and the losing side of a case. So, but the bottom line is that there's a lot of bad case law out there on voting systems, especially in the federal courts. And I'm not sure what the reason is for that, but one reason is that judges don't understand the technology and don't understand the risk, number one. And number two is that there are practical concerns where a judge does not want to fashion a remedy that may interfere with election administration. So we can talk a little bit about those, but for my presentation today, I want to talk a little bit about what we know happened in 2016, and I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what election assets need to be protected, because we've only been talking about one so far, and then I want to talk a little bit about what steps are being taken so far, and I'll give you a little bit of insight of things that we did in Pennsylvania while I was there, but things are going on nationally. With that, Barbara showed you a long list of companies that were breached. State governments get breached too. This is a headline from South Carolina where the Department of Revenue of South Carolina was breached, and they took out a whole bunch of personally identifying information, including Social Security numbers and tax records. And it was a big deal, and the governor at the time, Nikki Haley, took a lot of political flack, and whoever was in charge of revenue in South Carolina was fired. So I put that slide up there to let you know that state governments take this seriously. State governments are large, complex organizations. They oversee enormous IT assets. When I was at the Department of State, I oversaw the IT department for the Department of State. And you're talking about organizations that have tens of thousands of employees. So at the state level, this risk is certainly taken seriously. But because most of us in state government, some of us who have been in state government understand this, it's like drinking from a fire hose. You are required to do enormous amounts of work and at a high standard of quality with very few resources. And basically it comes down to what's on the to-do list for today. And that's why the 2016 election brought election assets to the top of that list. So a little bit of overview of the 2016 election. In January of 2017, the Joint Security Agencies issued a report. This was at the tail end of the Obama administration, detailing Russian interference with American elections. I'm not going to go into all the details of the report. There's a couple of takeaways because, but some of the specific details were not released. A lot of what they found was not declassified. But I think what you can take away from that is that the Russians ordered interference, that it was ordered at the highest level of the Russian administration. The reason I grew up there, I don't know if anybody's Despicable Me fans, but GRU is the acronym for the Russian Intelligence Agency. A significant portion of this report had to do with propaganda and trolls and social media manipulation of the electorate, which we're not going to get into today. But the other thing that the report said is that they had no evidence that any election results were affected or compromised. And I submit to you, it's irrelevant. Do I think anything happened with the election results? I don't think so. It doesn't matter. What matters is that a nation state with unlimited resources, I mean, let's be clear about that. A nation state with unlimited resources has been proven to have attempted to meddle in our elections. It doesn't matter what happened. It's irrelevant. They were there, and they probably have emboldened other bad actors. That's the takeaway. not the details or did somebody's election result get changed. Doesn't matter. They were out there, and the consensus in the intelligence community is that they will be back. And so what's lacking right now is a sense of urgency to do something about it. So I'm going to review a little bit now of state assets, voter registration databases. Under the Help America Vote Act, they're required to be centralized in every state. They are usually maintained at the state level. There are some states in which there's top down versus bottom up. For example, in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania maintains the data, and then each county has the ability to change, modify, or delete the data at the county level. These are just examples from Pennsylvania. We have the ability to check a voter registration status. We have online voter registration, a substantial and successful reform that I introduced while I was there. And we also have the ability to check our polling place. Those are all internet-facing applications that are accessed over the web. We also have a campaign finance filing application that users can use to file their campaign finance reports and to register. And we have a lobbying registration application. These are all on the internet, and they are all a pathway in if somebody wanted to get in. So this is an example of our election night returns website. They had a special election recently in Pennsylvania. That's what it looks like. So the local county networks are connected to the state networks, especially through the voter registration database. So the state itself doesn't make any changes to the voter registration databases. Those registrations come into a locality, they make changes, and that's transmitted to the state. But you're only as strong, as your weakest link. So they could go in through the county and then be able to travel laterally across networks to get into the state. The most common and successful attacks are phishing, which is where spoof emails, and we do have evidence that there were spoof emails directed at election officials in 2016, and also denial of service attacks, which basically try to crash your system. So the other election assets, which the video is showing you as a precinct voting devices, they are also computers. The devices themselves are computers. They're programmed by computers, and the question is, where are they exposed? Do they have exposures either because they are programmed by a computer that's connected to the internet, or because they have embedded hardware that could be exploited by an attacker? It's true, most precinct voting devices are not connected to the internet, but that doesn't mean, that's not protective. It's not protective enough. So this is that's just a picture of a high-speed central count scanner that processes paper ballots at a very high rate of speed. They're also part of the election assets. So there's been a sea change in cybersecurity. Before, there was a focus on prevention. Now, cybersecurity experts, you saw the list of people who have been hacked. You know, Target, the Office of Personnel Management, Home Depot, the list goes on. We know many, many organizations have been hacked. So the change has been from prevention to monitor, detect, respond, and recover. That's what you have to do. And you have to do that in different ways. So for networks, you have to be able to, you have to have a plan, a disaster recovery plan, and you have to anticipate the threat model and practice. That's something, for example, what would be disruptive on election night? If there was a denial of service attack on election night returns, or if somebody went into the election night returns website and tried to change the results, that would be disruptive. That would cause people to question the returns. So we all know, those of us in election administration know that those actual returns, they reside at the county level. What's on the website, those are just the unofficial results that people are reporting, because at some point people decided that speed was a value rather than accuracy. But anyway, putting that aside, if somebody were to fool around with those numbers, that would cause disruption. So you have to have a plan B, which we did in Pennsylvania, that if there was an attack, we could stand up an alternate site, and without no one would notice, it would be seamless, and it would keep the confidence in the election process where it needed to be. So for precinct voting devices, Barbara was touching on this. You have to have a way to monitor, detect, respond, and recover for precinct devices too. And for now, given the current state of technology, right now that's a paper ballot. And so paper ballots, there's a lot, I understand there are risks associated with paper ballots, any of you who but we know how to deal with that, with chain of custody and storage of materials. Anybody who practices in the criminal arena knows we know how to deal with physical, to protect physical data like that. Paper can't be altered by software. That's one way it cannot be altered, and that's why it's protective and allows you to detect any discrepancy and correct it. But as Barbara said, you can't, it's not enough just to have the paper, you have to look at it, and you have to look at it in a meaningful way. And what verified voting advocates for are called risk limiting audits, and that's a statistical method of looking at of sampling. It's essentially a sampling of the ballots, just like you would do polling. And it gives you a very high level of quality assurance in the most effective way, using the least amount of resources in order to be sure that the results are correct. Now, I don't want to, before I get to the federal statutes that are pending, there has been research that have been done on an entirely, completely electronic voting system. You may see this acronym E2E-VIV, an end-to-end verifiable internet voting system. There's no high assurance, commercial grade system available today that would be an entirely electronic system. They still have all the same risks of attack as an internet voting system. There's still verifiability issues associated with them, and there's still privacy issues. And many of you who work with state constitutions may know that many state constitutions have a secrecy provision in them that says that voters' choices, election choices, must be secret by secret ballot. So to the extent you can trace back an electronic ballot to the voter, that's going to violate a state constitution. So there is R&D going on in this area. Blockchain is not the answer. Blockchain doesn't solve some problems, not this problem. But there's nothing on the horizon, and the risk of hacking is at an unacceptable level to have an 100% electronic. So the Senate Bill 2261 is called the Secure Elections Act. It was introduced in December. It has bipartisan support. Senator Lankford, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Graham, Senator Harris, and Senator Collins, and I can't read that, Henrik, I think, introduced this bill. And the significant provisions of this, first of all, the federal constitution delegates to the state to run elections. It keeps that separation, but it improves information sharing between the federal, state, and local governments, because one of the big criticisms in the 2016 election was that the federal security agencies knew that this was going on, but it hadn't trickled down to the states. And in fact, 21 states weren't notified that they had been targeted until 2017, and we still don't know exactly what targeted means. Was it automated scanning? That happens today. Pennsylvania fends off millions upon millions of automated scans on a daily basis. Or was it something else? We don't know the extent of it. But this bill would allow information sharing among the different levels of government in order for them to prepare to respond to an attack. It also, the big point of this is that it provides grant money. Not enough, probably about $380 million, but the grant money would go towards states improving their cybersecurity practices, but also would prioritize some states who have the most vulnerable systems. There are 5 states in the country that 100% of voters vote on vulnerable machines that do not have a software independent record of intent. It's Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana. 100% of voters. In Pennsylvania, 83% of voters vote on vulnerable voting systems. Something that I worked on while I was there, still a work in progress. Texas has a significant portion. So does Kentucky and Indiana. So although across the nation, 70% of voters use voter-marked paper ballot, within individual states, the percentages are very difficult. And when you're talking about an electoral college, that has an impact when it comes down to how a candidate does in a particular state. So in any event, the grant program would just subsidize state governments to replace their voting systems. And the other thing that happened since the 2016 election was that the Department of Homeland Security designated elections as critical infrastructure. And this is just a little flow chart of what that means as a practical matter. This is a slide from the Election Assistance Commission. Again, this actually percolates election assets up in the priority of what's going to be protected. It allows election officials to be at the front of the line when they need services. The Department of Homeland Security offers a lot of services to states and local governments, and it puts them, they can jump the line because of the critical infrastructure. They're putting together coordinating councils. They're trying to organize, but again, I would submit that they need to work a little bit faster on this. I think that's all I want to say, except I want to say the need, some people look at paper ballots as a step backwards. It's just, I don't look at it that way, and in my own county, we vote on paper ballots because of advocacy that was done 10 years ago. And there's a local state house district that has been recounted twice, first in 2006 and again in 2016. And both times, the winner of the election, the margin of victory was 24 votes. And the county hand counted those paper ballots in 2 business days, and everybody sat in there and everybody saw it. And there were a couple of ambiguous ballots, not enough to change the outcomes, but at the end of the day, the press, the candidates, the public, everybody had confidence that that was the winner of the election, and the person was seated in the House, and nobody is squawking. And that's what we need to get to, where the winners understand that they won, and the losers accept that they have lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. It's now my honor and privilege to present the Honorable Virginia M. Covington to give her presentation.
All right, well, thank you. It's my honor and privilege to get to be with you today. So you've talked to your expert, you've talked to your lawyer, and now you're ready to go to court. And some of the questions that you're going to have to answer are, number one, what court do I go to? Do I go to state court? Do I go to federal court? And when do I file my lawsuit? And when I file my lawsuit, what am I going to expect? So as I looked through some of the cases on election law, I noticed a couple of things. First of all, these cases are increasing and increasing by the day. For instance, from the period 1996 to 1999, there was an average of about 96 cases filed per year. From 2001 to 2008, 237 cases per year, and those numbers continue to go up and have doubled in the past 10 years. So this is something that is increasing and increasing on a regular basis. However, most of the cases are filed in state court. Although we in federal court do see some of these cases in the Middle District of Florida, we haven't seen any in the past few years, but about 15 years ago and 18 years ago, we did have a number of these cases in other divisions within the Middle District of Florida. But to me, really one of the most important questions has to do with when do you file one of these cases, and that really impacts on, I think, the reaction that you're going to see from the judge that you're in front of. So if it's pre-election, normally what you find is that you either have a state elected official that's brought the lawsuit, or maybe it's a voters group, or maybe it's just some private citizens. And sometimes it has to do with tension between the access of individuals to exercise their right to vote versus uniform standards for review of votes, but oftentimes it has to do with things like natural disasters or natural circumstances. You know, you talked a little bit earlier about Florida, of course, where I'm from. Well, hurricane season in September. What happens if in September, which is the height of hurricane season, there's a primary election, the hurricane is coming in, and it's destined to land in Hillsborough County, Florida, right on Tuesday of the preliminary voting period? What do? and you're the judge and you have the case, and you get this case on Monday and the hurricane is set to hit Tampa on Tuesday. Do you extend the voting period? Well, judges who have had that kind of issue facing them most certainly, by the most part, have extended the voting period. And those types of questions really don't seem that difficult to me. We want to do what's right. We want to give people the opportunity to vote. What about a website crash? Well, that's what happened in the state of Virginia in a case called New Virginia Majority. And on the last day of voter registration, the state's online registration system crashed. What did the district court judge do? District court judge did the right thing. He granted an extension of time for voter registration. Again, the concept is, let's give people the opportunity to vote. Sometimes the courts, for whatever reasons, aren't able to do the right thing. I'll give you an example of a situation in New York. In 2016, there were two individuals who wanted to be on the ballot on the Republican primary, and initially, one of the individuals had been told that he didn't have enough signatures. He needed over 1,200 signatures. The initial thought was he didn't have enough, and so his name was kept off he was kept off the list to be able to vote. So what happened, they then did a recount of the names, and they did determine that he did have enough signatures to be placed on the ballot. But guess what? The state court said, too late. Sorry, even though you do have the right number of signatures, we're not going to let your name go on the ballot. It's too late to do that. The gentleman went to federal court. The district court ruled in his favor, and the district court said, well, this is an exceptional set of circumstances. You ought to get on the ballot. Went up to the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit said, no, federal court, you don't have the right to step into this. This is a state court decision, and the state court spoke, and the gentleman's name is not on the ballot. So those who voted in the primary in upstate New York that year were denied really the right to have two individuals to choose from who to vote for. They only had the right or the opportunity to choose one name. So sometimes, these things don't quite turn out the way that you hope they would. We want to give people as much choice and as much opportunity as possible. Pre-election, normally, you don't have the opportunity to argue sour grapes. Really what you're looking at in most of the cases that I've been able to review is you want to make certain that things are done fairly and that everybody has the opportunity to come out and to exercise their right to vote. If there are allegations of fraud, you have the opportunity to look at them and try to come up with a resolution, not with just a few hours to decide, but hopefully with a few months to decide and to try to do the right thing. The second type of cases that are brought are right there on Election Day. And those are cases that are more problematic, and some of the cases that I've been able to see have to do with disparity in the way that different voters in different precincts are treated. For instance, in some precincts, voters have to show a driver's license to be able to vote. In other precincts, those rules aren't really enforced. And so on the day of the election, somebody comes to federal court and wants to try to have that disparate enforcement of rules ironed out, or that voters are treated in a more fair fashion. And those are really difficult cases because it's right on Election Day. And so a judge has to answer the question, what is it that you want me to do? Do you want me to stop this election? Do you want me to extend the election? Do you want us to count these votes as provisional votes? And so those are very challenging cases because the role of the court is more difficult to ascertain in other situations compared to other situations where you have a little bit more time to analyze and to decide what the right thing is. Most of the time when it's the day of election, the judges will accept those votes as provisional votes and then decide whether it's fair to count those votes or not later on. Finally, what we have, and really most appropriate to what we're talking about today, and those are post-election lawsuits. And generally speaking, those come up where there are allegations of fraud or allegations of abuse, And after the election, obviously somebody's won, somebody's lost, but the loser is alleging that there's been some type of fraud and wants the court to either set aside the votes or to set aside the certification or to delay the certification of the votes. So you're now in court. Do you go to federal court or do you go to state court? Well, to go to federal court, you have to have a federal question. And so normally what you're looking at is a violation of a constitutional right. Maybe it's a due process violation is normally the one, or equal protection, or some of the ones that I've seen. But even when those allegations are made, sometimes the federal court will say this is a state court issue, or the party lacks standing, the court lacks jurisdiction, even if you've made that allegation, and the matter will go back to state court. As I said, most of these cases do end up being resolved in the state court form as opposed to the federal form. In federal court, normally you're going to find yourself there on a preliminary injunction. You may have a party who files a temporary restraining order or a motion for a temporary restraining order. Those are done very quickly. They're ex parte, without notice, and things move very, very quickly. Generally speaking, though, for matters such as this, voting issues, I think that a lot of judges would take that TRO and turn it into a preliminary injunction and have both parties come into the courthouse for a hearing, even if it's done on short notice, even if it's done the following day. What becomes most problematic for individuals on preliminary injunctions, and I say this having had probably at least 100 preliminary injunctions in the 14 years or so that I've been a district court judge, the hardest criteria to meet is success on the merits. And so if I were hearing a preliminary injunction case on something as important as a voting issue, most certainly this is something that would be set for a hearing. I would feel that, if you were the lawyer on the case, very strongly consider bringing in a live witness. Although you can do a preliminary injunction on affidavits, I would think that the importance and the value of having a live witness, somebody such as Barbara to come in and testify, and we do look at credentials. I most certainly look at credentials. These are expert witnesses, and it's really important that we're able to rely on what the expert has to say, and it's an area where credentials are important. And you look to see what the expert has to say. Was there fraud involved? Are these valid votes? Is there the potential that there was a miscounting or a miscalculation? And more importantly, what are you relying on to make that determination? Those are the kinds of questions that are going to be asked of the expert, and those are the kinds of questions that the lawyer should ask, and even the judges would ask of the experts. I think most judges take preliminary injunctions really seriously. I know this isn't a 10-year case. It isn't even a 10-month case or a 10-day case. Most preliminary injunctions, you move very quickly. And I know at least my law clerks, we look at our docket regularly, probably 6 or 7 times a day. Everything is electronic today, so things move very quickly. And if you file a motion for a temporary restraining order or a motion for a preliminary injunction, it's going to move quickly, particularly in this area. You should expect a hearing, and I would say you should be prepared to talk about those issues. If you think that there's fraud, be prepared to prove it, at least to the satisfaction that you more likely than not are going to be able to prevail in a lawsuit, and make certain that you can meet that most challenging criteria. So again, it's been an interesting area of the law to review. Sometimes parties choose not to go to court. For instance, the state of Virginia, I don't know if you read about that recently, where there was a tie vote. And then this is the value of paper ballots. On one of those ballots, there was a problem with respect to the way that that particular voter had indicated his vote, and it looked as if the vote had been crossed out. That vote wasn't counted, and the two candidates decided to go ahead and go with drawing a name out of a bull, and the person whose name was drawn was the person who won the election. So sometimes not going to court is a good thing. Sometimes, even though it's done that way, as long as everybody agrees that this is a fair and appropriate way of resolving it, and the winner knows that the winner's won, and the loser knows that the loser's won, there's nothing wrong with that. And the most important thing is that you go forward to the next step, and that life goes on, and that citizens have their elected officials to support them and to guide them. So I enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a minimum of 20 minutes left, and I'm actually planning on going over, so if anybody gets upset at me at around 3 o'clock, two things you can do. First, you can leave, and second, you can yell at me, but don't yell at me till after we finish up. I want to go back to Russ. I'm going to show another clip. I'm actually going to start, and then I'm going to...
I need to just introduce it, please.
You will. I'm going to show another clip, but before I do that, I want to ask, and it's actually going to be in two parts because I'm going to rush through something in the middle. I want two things to be discussed before we show the clip. First is, what is a memory card? And that sounds a little bit like a bland question, but it's actually going to be very important when we view this clip. And the second is, how did this Hursty hack, as it's referred to, come about, and who is Harry Hursty? So first I'm going to ask Barbara to explain to us the difference between a memory card on a computer and any other kind of card, and particularly what does it mean to have executable code on a card and not?
Well, a memory card is pretty much what it's called. It stores. It's a memory device. It stores information. And basically, the thing about computers is that everything in the computer is just zeros and ones. So you could have information like names, just a bunch of zeros and ones, or you could actually have code, computer commands that also look like zeros and ones. And just looking at the zeros and ones, if you don't know what these things look like, you really can't distinguish. So that's why a memory card could actually conceivably have executable code on it, because it's just all zeros and ones. Is that the kind of answer you want, Andy?
Yes, but I'm going to ask Russ if he can discuss how that fits into the clip that we're about to show.
Oh. Well, I found Harry Hursty because a Finnish friend of a friend of mine said, I know this guy from Finland who's a genius, and he can tell if a computer is doing something bad from 3 rooms away or even outside the building. And I thought, well, that's somebody I have to meet, and we have to get him to America. At first, he refused to come. He thought that it was just that America had instituted such a vulnerable system that was being described. But when he saw the source code and a few other documents, he came. Now, the memory card holds the vote data, but he wanted to know, what else does it hold? Is there anything else on there? And, well, I managed to get him one, and it was, I won't say how, but it was through a various back door. I managed to get him one that had actually been used in an election. So he could test his theory. Did it actually hold more than just the vote data? Now, Diebold, the election company, who've now stepped out of the election business, so they were owned by another company who was then sold to another company. They're now owned by a company called Dominion, which is Dominion Voting Systems, which is Canadian. Diebold got quite upset with Beth Harris and Harry Hursty doing some tests, making accusations based on pretty good science, I think. And they sent out emails and letters to election officials around America saying there is no executable code in our memory cards. This is not true. So we wanted to put them to a test. Now, what you need to know for this clip coming up is the memory card that Hurry touches is the only part of the system that he's allowed to have any access to. They fly about during elections, or they used to on the older machines, they still do. And it's very easy to pick one up in an office and take it away. It's very easy to slip another one into an election in the heat of the election day when nobody notices and just puts it in a pile. So I was convinced from the start this was a very easy bit of malware or bit of badness to get into an election if Hurry could prove it. Now, Cuyahoga County in Ohio was about to buy the Diebold system, these are touch screens they were buying mainly, for $24 million. So I wrote a question for Beth Harris to ask the Diebold representatives who were going there to sell the final pitch for $24 million worth of election equipment. And the one other person you need to know, apart from Hurry Hursty, large Finnish chap, is Ion Sancho is an election official. He retired recently, but he has the most integrity of anyone I've ever met in the elections industry as an official. He said, if you and Hurry can show something I don't know about my own system, that I really should, and he was suspicious of the Diebold claims, then come in and prove it to me. So we took him up on his offer, and the last thing you need to know is this word GEMS. GEMS is the central tabulator. It stands for Global Election Management System. And it's the one machine to rule them all. So while there are voting machines all over the precincts, they all feed their votes into the central tabulator called GEMS if it's the Diebold system. And so Hurry's challenge was, can you change the votes in a voting machine in the way that Diebold says can't be done? And can you get it past that into the main tabulator and make that the official vote that the election official, Ion Sancho, signs off on? What you'll see now is the proof, what we found.
Okay, can we switch back? We're on?
Thumb drive, oh, okay.
Hurry realized that every vote is stored on a memory card before the totals are printed. So if you can hack the memory cards, you can control an election.
The real vulnerability has to be very, very close to the source of the information. In that environment, the only possibility was the memory card.
Hurry wanted to find out what exactly was inside the Diebold ballot box. And so he bought a memory card reader off the internet. And within a couple of days, he found that the cards didn't just contain votes. There was a program or executable code.
Well, if someone would have told me that in this system there is a living thing, an executable, modifiable program stored in the same place as the very data which is the most secure in this system, I would say you have to be misunderstanding something, crazy, or lying.
Hurry wrote a report for black box voting, warning that this program, lurking in the memory card, could be used to change the result of an election.
What happened after that was that Diebold basically dismissed and stonewalled the report.
Diebold sent letters to officials across America denying that there was any executable code on the memory cards.
I want to stop for a moment because I think this is very, very significant, and I want to make sure that it's understood. We have a ballot box. Think of putting your paper ballots into the box. When you then go to count what's in the box, you can have pretty good assurance that whatever went into the box is what's going to come out of the box. But think for a moment if there was a little gnome inside the box who had a pen and had the ability, and some whiteout, and had the ability to play with the ballots. Now, I had asked a lot of questions about memory cards. Ideally, a memory card is like that box. You put votes in electronically, And there's no code, there's no gnome that can change what's been put in, and then you just read them out again. But assume for the moment that there was executable code, not just dead core memory, but something that actually is active, that living thing that Kirsty mentioned. Then you might be able to change what is recorded within the memory card. And I want you to think of that while I show the next portion of this clip. And I have to run this a little bit, so bear with me to get to where I want to go.
Wait, are you doing that? Can I say something?
Yes.
I just wanted to correct one thing in my talk. I said that the Ohio study was done by a group called Oasis. That's actually another group that's involved with voting. The name of the Ohio study was Everest, like the mountain. So, my mistake.
Barbara, keep talking because.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, one thing, and I'll turn it to Marion. Marion talked about risk limiting audits. A key point is that although you normally don't look at a lot of ballots because it's sampling, if you start finding problems, you look at more and more and more. And if there's a problem with the results, you may end up doing a total manual recount. Take it away.
I just wanted to say, are you ready?
Say what you want, and then we're ready.
No, go ahead.
Go.
On the,
Go ahead, Ben. Go, Andy.
So Bev decided it was time to make something drastic happen. 3 months later, Diebold was back in town to complete the sale.
Knowing that Diebold was going to be showing up at a public meeting, the next strategy was to go there and get their head engineer on videotape saying you can't change the votes on the memory card.
So my question for Diebold would be, again, either do you not know what was done in these security tests, or did you just tell something that's not true?
I think that deserves a response from Diebold and Ms. Harris's question.
The question was changing votes, and did they know or not?
It is my understanding that because there is no executable program on the memory card, that the actual votes on the memory card cannot be altered.
Could you remind us, are you an engineer yourself?
No, I am not an engineer, but I work with our engineering crew. In fact, Pat, you want to step up here for 1 second?
Hi, I'm Pat Green. I'm Director of Research and Development for eVoting.
Okay.
Ms. Harris, could you phrase your question again?
Can votes be changed using only a memory card?
No, I do not believe votes can be changed using only a memory card. That particular situation is detected by the software. The report that was written, that I have read, guesses that something like that might be possible, but says that they did not actually accomplish that or even test that.
These are very strong statements. These are statements that we took to be a challenge. These are statements that we wanted to find out if they were true or not.
And so Bev went back to Tallahassee to see if votes could be changed. For Ian, there was another reason to test the memory cards. As one of the most trusted Florida election officials, he had been appointed to oversee the 2000 presidential recount. The recount might have discovered why Volusia County's computers counted backwards to minus 16,022 votes. But when the Supreme Court stopped that recount, Ian was left with unanswered questions.
One of the reasons that interests me about the Volusia County situation and what happened there is that we in Leon County used the identical voting system, the Diebold AccuVote 2000. And in the 17 years that I've been an election administrator, my experience is that that kind of subtraction cannot occur accidentally. Someone consciously tried to affect that computer system and consciously tried to perpetuate a fraud, to steal votes.
During his research, Hari had discovered that Diebold's memory cards effectively allowed negative votes.
Well then, go dead. What we're going to do here is modify one card and then bring it to the election supervisor Iyer Sanchez's office. Plug it as the real card in any election to the real election system and run ballots through. And that's the same system which have been used in a number of previous elections. And we'll see that what is the power in the ballot box. This should be just an empty box containing the votes, but it has more capabilities than that. So it's a very simple process. You just add the card in, you run the rewrite program, tell where to find the scanner, and tell exactly what file you want to be put in, and off it goes.
Hari's hack is a variation on stuffing the ballot box before anyone has voted. But this is always suspicious because you end up with more votes than voters. So Hari used 5 negative votes for one candidate and then gave the other one 5 positive votes. So as people cast their ballots, the total number of votes always equals the total number of voters. But was Hari right? Black box voting went back to Tallahassee for the ultimate test. Bev asked Susan Pynchon from Volusia County to observe. She too had found evidence of problems with the memory cards while sifting the trash from the Volusia County Board of Elections.
This is from Mark Early of Diebold, and it says, how did the number of memory card failures on election day increase from the 17 reported on November 3rd to 25? I don't know if we'll ever know why these memory cards failed, or if, see, one of the big questions in my mind is, did they actually fail? Or could they have been used for other purposes?
Hi, how are you doing, Susan? Good to see you.
Susan Berniker from Louisiana and Dr. Hugh Thompson also came to watch Hari's hack.
Always good to see you.
Always good to see you, Kathleen. Come on in. Well, let me tell you what we're going to do today. We have constructed a mini election, but Harry Hersey, as you have served as a technical advisor of how to do this, we're going to ask you to remain outside. After you, let me introduce you to my election staff. To ensure that we've not prepared some sort of a device that has been pre-rigged, pick the number, and then we'll grab that unit, and that will be the device that we will count the ballots on.
I just feel like this is the one.
Okay, and the winner is unit 15191. 5191. What we have here is a programmed optical scan ballot. There is only one question on this ballot. Can the votes on the Diebold system be hacked using the memory card?
I have only touched the memory card, not the other parts of the Diebold election system, which is going to be used today. Only the memory card.
And I can certainly speak for myself and Harry, and that we're going to vote yes.
All right, then let's have the rest of us vote no. 2 individuals, Hugh and Harry, will be voting yes. The rest of us will be voting no. And then we'll scrutinize the ballots afterwards to ensure that that is indeed the mark.
I will say that I'm wrong and Diebold is right, and I'm going to say, no, they cannot be hacked.
It's impossible. So I vote no.
I'm going to film myself voting. Excuse me.
I'm going to mark this ballot no. Dr. Thompson?
I am going to bar this ballot yes. I've seen some pretty concerning things.
Well, it's down to you. You're the last voter, Harry.
All right. I think it could be. So I vote for yes.
You will be the second yes.
All right. Here is the memory card I have touched.
Okay. Now, this is the only piece of Diebold equipment that you've used.
That's correct.
Well, thank you. Let me take your ballot in. This card will go into this slot. The next activity that the election worker does on the morning of the election is turn the machine on, making it live to receive votes. When you do that, this machine will produce what is called a zero total tape. The machine is going through a self-test analysis, and then it'll spontaneously turn on. This is Harry's card that is telling us that there are 0 votes stored in the memory. Okay, let me get the ballots. Let's insert a yes ballot. We're going to put in another no. 7. And the last no ballot, 8. Placing the ender card in this device and telling it to turn off its counting function and do its reporting function will now cause the voting machine to print out a tape reading the number of votes that it had just read. Oh my.
Oh, no.
What is it? What is it?
7 yes, 1 no.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. Let me see.
Here's the tape.
7 people said it could be hacked.
And we put through
6 and 2.
6
6
no's
no's and 2 yes.
Oh my gosh, do you know what this means?
How do we know that Hari didn't just change the report and the votes themselves on the memory card are still correct? If that was the case, when they go into GEMS, the results would be different, isn't that right?
I mean, the only way to know that is to read them into GEMS and to check the vote totals.
See what GEMS says. Should we do that?
I think we should, because I want to confirm for my own analysis, is this just a superficial
Right, that's a good
hack? In other words,
question.
did we just change the words on this paper? And we will upload this memory card if I...
Okay, that is why we are here today. Too often computers are considered to be almighty devices. They are not. They have errors and they can be manipulated. And I think you've seen that today, and you've also heard a lot about what can be done about it, both in terms of technology and in terms of legislation. And we also, I want to thank Russ Michaels for what he's done in putting together this documentary, and let me thank the rest of the panel. And if we can have a little bit of an applause. If there are any questions, speak now, or forever hold your peace until we do this again. Yes?
So I'm from a place that we can't even vote for president.
Okay, let me, one quick. Russ, can you hear this question or not?
Wait, there's a mic coming.
Speak louder. I can speak
There's
louder.
a mic.
I think I can hear it.
So I'm from a place, I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands, so we can't even vote for president. But putting that to the side, why isn't there more outrage? So much policy has changed over the last year. Why aren't people, if this is so pervasive, why is this not like?
Well, so I'll take a stab at it. First of all, there's a lot of the work that was done in this movie was done 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, and so I think that in the election administration, election officials discount what has happened because this is really a risk, not a certainty. And that's what election officials are, they're risk managers. And so there are steps you can take to manage the risk. You cannot get the risk down to zero. So that's why you have to have a plan, a disaster recovery plan, and the best way to do that is to have a paper ballot. I just want to point out that the Hersty attack, that the first Hersty hack was on those are optical scan systems with paper ballots, which underscores the need to look at the paper and make sure that the electronic tally is correct, and that's what we advocate with risk-limiting audits. He did do a second hack after that on another Diebold TSX machine that he showed similar ability to infiltrate the computers. What I want to emphasize is that there are steps, there are mitigations if you program correctly. You can build security in from the ground up. These machines that were deployed after the Help America Vote Act didn't do that. But the problem, the takeaway here is that they're still out in the field. And so there isn't a sense of urgency, certainly not in leadership in Congress, to do something about this. So, but I think that people have to demand that the processes that surround our democracy are verifiable and instill confidence in the elections. But I will say that you have to frame it in a way that, most election officials want to run good elections. They want to do a good job. They are woefully underfunded and understaffed, and they're looking at what can save me time and effort. What is unambiguous? And that's where the voting system vendors are able to make a good sales pitch.
So if I could just join in really quickly, most of this session has been talking about the risks and the vulnerabilities of our voting systems. Please keep in mind that we have a solution. And as Marion has been saying, we need paper ballots and we need to check them with risk-limiting audits. If we do that, and if we have good chain of custody of the papers, we basically can provide very good protection against all these attacks, because if there is an attack, it will be uncovered.
Andy, can I
Yes.
answer?
Yes.
The most important line in my whole film followed exactly where you stopped. Ion Sancho, after he witnessed the hack, and he was quite speechless for a good 10, 20 seconds, he didn't know what to say, but he looked at the results on the tape, because the tape comes out of the machine, just as you saw. There were actually two hacks. The zero, saying that machine produced a zero report, saying there were no votes in it. That was also a hack. So there were two going on, not just to change the vote totals. It was also to say 0 votes in at the beginning. But he says to the camera, what went on behind this, I would have certified this as the elected official as a true and honest count of the vote. And I think it puts election officials in a terrible position that they have to rely on the equipment that's produced by a private company that's looking to make profit, when actually, as Marion and Barbara are saying, that really all you have to do is audit the election afterwards, and then Ion would have known that that election, that mini election, which he was in on, of course, had been rigged, because the only proof was on those pieces of paper. But he was shocked because he had no power in Florida to do a recount or even an audit. He would have had to push for it. And then the vendors tried to get him out of his job, and so did Jeb Bush. So I felt, I'm still very emotional watching that. He nearly lost his job to prove that election officials need a paper audit to show that the ballots actually are what they say they are, and not what a computer only says the result is. Does that help?
I'm going to take one more question if there is one, and then I'm going to play that last statement, and then we're going to call it a day.
Andy, there is one.
Yes?
Can I get a two-parter in?
Go ahead.
The first question, and maybe you've already answered it, so for Canadians, we still, other than the examples you showed in Ontario, we still use paper ballots. And when you say paper ballots, I think there's a number of different images of what that is, because for us a paper ballot is literally a small piece of paper where we mark with a pen or a pencil an X, and it's counted by eyes. There is no computer counting system at all. And so my question is, why is that not being put forward as an option? Is that just purely a cost issue, or is there?
And I think Barbara maybe should, as an American who knows how many complicated elections there are in America, perhaps Barbara or Marion, you'd like to explain that.
Yeah, I actually worked as a poll worker in the BC election in 2006, I think it was, and there we had two pieces of paper because there was also one on instant runoff voting, and I was really impressed with how that was run. I mean, I thought it was done. I mean, we Canadians do it right. But the reason that it was so easy to do, and we hand counted it afterwards, and we couldn't even leave the room until everything matched, and one table was off by one. And it took us an hour to figure out what the problem was, and I was really hungry. So the difference is it's a parliamentary system. And so that election in BC, you vote for your member of parliament, and you couldn't even do write-ins. If you wanted to do a write-in, you had to go ahead of time and do that. So the names are already on the ballot, you exit, then we sort them into piles, and we count each pile. It's very easy. You should see the ballots in California, 3 pages. I mean,
California's anomalous. I mean, the other question is how many voters in a particular precinct or election division in Canada?
No, that's not, I don't think that's.
Because there are thousands, some precincts in some of our states have tens of thousands of voters in a single precinct, and you're not going to be able to hand count those. So in the one House race that I mentioned in Chester County, there were 23,000 ballots. You can't count those by hand in a night. And so there are places in the U.S. where they do hand counted paper ballots, but generally, as I said, speed is the value.
Right. The average Canadian federal constituency is 100,000 people.
And they vote in one place?
No, they vote in a number of, just like you would.
But
where they have local electorate.
They're enough poll workers, and we just count them. It's real easy.
How many ballots are you counting?
But
it's one race, right?
Yeah, it's one race. That's the thing, is it's one race.
So we have, even in the simplest, Pennsylvania has a lot simpler ballots. They have a lot of what we call ballot clutter in California. And we don't have initiatives, we don't have ballot initiatives, but our simplest races would be the presidential year where you have president, you might have a U.S. Senate, maybe not, and then House of Congress, state representative, possibly a state senator, and maybe another local question. But that's 6 or 7 races, and other localities have a lot more races. And it's going to be hard to do a hand count of that on election night after 13 hours in the polls.
The reason that a lot of Ontario towns have computers is that the municipal ballots are more complicated, and they are hard to count by hand. In Ontario, the provincial and the federal elections are still manually counted.
And sorry, the part 2, and I don't know if we have time for this, is both of you mentioned that blockchain is not the answer, but didn't give us even just an overview of if we could just get a very brief explanation for why that is, because I think a lot of people are peddling blockchain as an option.
Blockchains don't deal with malware on the voter's machine. They don't deal with malware on the election official's machine. They don't deal with denial of service attacks. They don't deal with vote buying and selling. There are all kinds of issues that they don't deal with, but in particular, they really don't touch the security issues. And it's basically impossible for a voter to verify that her ballot was correctly recorded while maintaining the secret ballot with blockchains.
So, and I'm not a technologist, but my understanding with blockchain is that it is useful in a situation where there's no central authority, and then the miners have the authority. So what if the miner decided that they didn't want the vote that you wanted to include in the blockchain? Then they could make that decision, and you would have no recourse. So there's just so many, and I'm pretty sure that it doesn't solve the anonymity problem with the secret ballot. So I think that the point of blockchain is that you can trace back the transaction, and so that's not something we have. We have constitutions that say you can't. Your ballot is secret. But blockchain keeps coming up. It's the new flavor of the month, and it's a panacea for a lot of problems. It doesn't solve the voting, the issues with voting.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the DVD. Give my disc reader a chance to catch up.
If I had not seen what was behind this, I'd have no reason not to. I would have certified this election as a true and accurate result of a vote.
Thank you very much.